vision, he would routinely invite the predominantly white audiences that he played for at downtown clubs to visit Bronx joints. While he admitted that black audiences did not immediately see what he was trying to do and thought he was crazy as hell, eventually, blacks and whites appreciated and engaged with each other's cultural scenes. A proud Bambaataa recalled that his style change, quote, did its job, a little peace, unity, love, and having fun, and one nation under a groove, end quote. This presentation will explore a brief moment in the late 1970s and early 80s when downtown Manhattan was consumed by what the Bronx-based hip-hop group, the Cold Crush Brothers, called punk rock rap. In an increasingly segregated New York City, hip-hoppers and punk rockers would not allow race and genre to divide them socially or musically. This presentation is an intervention into the histories of two musics that have historically been narrowly studied along racial lines. While pioneers like Bambaataa, Grandmaster Caz, Fab Five Freddy, and their punk counterparts like Blondie, the Tom Tom Club, and The Clash have all emphasized how the two genres are inseparably linked, music historians and journalists have neither stressed nor in most cases even mentioned hip-hop and punk's many connections. That scholars have neglected to do so is especially puzzling given the similar conditions from which the two musics emerged. In the 1970s, Lower Manhattan, the epicenter of punk, and the South Bronx, the birthplace of hip-hop, were some of the most derelict parts of a near-bankrupt New York City. Indeed, both regions were largely ignored by increasingly neoconservative national, state, and local governments. One of the reasons that hip-hop and punk artists were able to interact and collaborate was because the two musics were in their infancy and had yet to be truly marketed, commodified, and racialized. Most music historians and journalists neglect to study hip-hop and punk together because of the power of such racialized marketing. Yet while the punk and hip-hop scenes influenced each other, I maintain that punk rock wielded greater influence over hip-hop. After all, in order for hip-hop to expand its fan base and allow artists to make money off of their craft, hip-hop had to come downtown. Owing to the pervasiveness of arson, drugs, and gangs, the average white New Yorker, and even the average punk, simply did not want to venture to the Bronx for any reason other than to see a Yankee game or to go to the zoo. Yet Bronxites refused to be confined by the little social space afforded to them, living in cramped slums, and created what hip-hop scholar Tricia Rose has called cross-cultural communication networks. By coming downtown, early hip-hop artists helped commercialize hip-hop and create modern hip-hop culture by bringing together the previously disparate art forms of graffiti, b-boying, DJing, and MCing. Young hip-hoppers and punk rockers came together in the late 1970s and early 80s at a highly segregated moment. Starting in the 1950s, both regions witnessed large-scale outmigration of mostly white second- and third-generation immigrants and in-migration of poorer West Indians, Puerto Ricans, and African Americans. Blue-collar jobs evaporated across the city, and housing in communities like the South Bronx and the Lower East Side was substandard at best. To make matters worse, nascent neoconservatives further divided the city along racial and class lines by lobbying the city to reduce or eliminate welfare and government aid to poor communities. Targeting areas like the South Bronx and Lower Manhattan, policymakers like Nathan Glazer and James Q. Wilson blamed the deterioration of New York City on cultural pathology and a culture of poverty endemic to non-white youths living in urban slums. Neoconservative policies like benign neglect and planned shrinkage, both of which were first articulated in 1969, sought to remove government services from sick communities like those in the Bronx and Lower Manhattan. A symbolic barrier had to be erected to separate wealthy areas like the Financial District and the Upper East Side from what James Q. Wilson and his acolytes called human cesspools. Likewise, in the late 1970s and early 80s, pop music, with its long history of crossover and miscegenation, offered little hope for cross-racial interaction. The popular musical landscape was so segregated between disco for blacks and rock for whites that in the late 1970s, crossover was almost non-existent. Yet for many hip-hop kids and punk kids, such division seems silly. Why dwell on differences when there was good music and art to be made? For transplanted middle-class punks living in decaying lower Manhattan, the South Bronx was, quote, the East Village's big sister slum to the north, end quote. Echoing these sentiments, Charlie Ahern, a punk visual artist and the director of Wild Style, exclaimed, quote, it wasn't about your little local neighborhood. Why shouldn't art be all city, end quote. Many punk rockers and hip-hoppers saw similarities between the two musics and cultures. After all, rebellious attitudes, loud music, do-it-yourself mentalities, commitment to community, and the desire to simplify music were not racially coded. During an era marked by what historian Rick Perlstein has described as Americans yearning for quiet, hip-hoppers and punk rockers jointly harnessed the power of noise and disrupted governmental attempts to maintain order through division. Yet before DJs, MCs, graffiti writers, b-boys, and hip-hop scenesters would flock to downtown punk clubs to party and interact with punk artists and fans, uptown and downtown kids met by coincidence and invitation. While downtown, they tried to make sense of one another. While most punk artists and musicians remember hip-hop coming downtown in 1981, around the time of the release of Blondie's song Rapture, hip-hop's visual art form had arrived much earlier. Around 1970, 3 years before the Bronx's first hip-hop block party, graffiti appeared downtown in the form of tagged subway cars. The first hip-hop DJ to play the Lower East Side, the cradle of punk, was likely DJ AJ. After he had hit it big in the Bronx, AJ was invited to DJ parties at Henry Street Settlement around 1977 or 1978. This owed to his local roots and connections. While he had never paid much attention to punk kids when he was growing up in Alphabet City, AJ knew of their existence well before most Bronx kids. The DJ took notice when punks comprised 10% of his crowd at his Henry Street Settlement shows. He recalled how odd they looked and noted how punks, quote, stood alone. They stood to the side. They stood isolated. They stood all together. They looked out of place, but there wasn't nothing else to do, and we was in their neighborhood, and we were probably in their favorite community center where they did punk rock parties. You're not going to not go because they're playing rap tonight. You're going to go in there and fit in any way possible, end quote. Before long, punks began to invite hip-hop artists to perform at downtown performance spaces like the Kitchen and the Mud Club. One early hip-hop artist needed no invitation to bring his work downtown. By tagging subway cars, Brooklyn native Fred Braithwaite, better known as Fab Five Freddy, invited himself downtown. In 1980, Freddie announced himself and his intention to bring graffiti to punk kids and downtown artists by tagging a subway car to look like one of Andy Warhol's signature Campbell soup cans. Freddie's paint job symbolically connected him to a downtown icon. In an effort to ensure that hip-hoppers were seen as sophisticated, fine artists rather than as folk artists, Freddie began spreading the message that hip-hop was a complete culture. After reading that a complete culture should include a music, dance, and visual art component, he thought about how he could connect graffiti, b-boying, DJing, and MCing. Freddie and Africa Bambaataa were some of the few hip-hoppers to envision these seemingly disparate art forms, what Bambaataa called the four pillars, as part of a broad hip-hop culture. Yet what truly brought these art forms together was hip-hop's move downtown. Perhaps the most enduring legacy from early 1980s hip-hop and punk interactions was inspired by a field trip to the Bronx that Freddie took with Chris Stein and Deborah Harry, who were both members of the punk band Blondie. Many music historians cite Blondie's 1981 song Rapture as the first rap song many white people ever heard. The song was a massive success and hit #1 on the Billboard charts. Crucially, the track paved the way for future hip-hop-inflected punk songs and punk-inflected hip-hop tracks. Unfortunately, I do not have the time today to properly discuss punk hip-hop fusion songs like Chris Stein and Grandmaster Caz's Wild Style theme, Africa Bambaata's Planet Rock, The Clash's The Magnificent Seven, and the Tom Tom Club's Wordy Rapping Hood. That said, it is important to note that these records bespoke a desire among punk and hip-hop artists to transcend racial and genre boundaries and to engage with each other's cultural scenes. By 1981, hip-hoppers and punk rockers had created an inclusive nightclub scene in which uptown and downtown cultures collided like never before. While the downtown club scene was hardly utopian, by partying together and forging connections, hip-hoppers and punk rockers helped to briefly connect a city separated by race and class. Uptown kids challenged these divisions by venturing outside their confined slums and establishing cross-cultural communication networks with like-minded downtown youths. Moreover, hip-hop artists could make a considerable amount of money performing in punk clubs, far more than they could in the South Bronx. Mike Diamond, who had later found the Beastie Boys, fondly recalled how New York in the early 1980s was, quote, a different city to how it is now. You had a totally integrated club scene, which has never been the case anywhere in America and isn't the case in New York now, end quote. While the song was a commercial failure, the Cold Crush Brothers would capture the spirit of unity across race and genre in the title of their 1983 single, Punk Rock Rap. Weekly hip-hop shows at punk venues began when British emigre Ruza Cool Lady Blue began hosting Wheels of Steel nights every Thursday at her East Village club, the Negril. Blue began recruiting punk kids to these shows, and before long, black and white kids packed into the Negril. The importance of white crowds was not lost on the young hip-hoppers. Jazzy J recalled that it was his mission to school downtown kids on Bronx art forms. When the fire department shut the packed club down, Blue set her eyes on a humongous venue in Lower Chelsea. Downtown hip-hop exploded in a converted skating ring called the Roxy. The Roxy was 20 times the size of the Negril, and during the disco era would not even allow blacks and Puerto Ricans to enter. Perhaps as a means of highlighting the club's nation integration, Blue hung a sign outside the Roxy's entrance which read, "Come in peace through music." Blue and most of the Roxy's regulars hoped that the club could bring together and heal a divided city. Fab Five Freddy fondly reminisced how the club featured, quote, ill b-boys with the poses and shit, checking out these kids with crazy haircuts. Everybody kind of got into each other, so to speak. That's when it really kind of took off as the first major downtown club that had a legitimately mixed scene, end quote. Moreover, on a typical night at the Roxy, all four pillars of hip-hop would converge. Graffiti artists like the Bronx-bred Futura 2000 would spray paint a hanging canvas, while Africa Islam or Grand Mixer DST spun, Melly Mel rapped, and Crazy Legs and the Rocksteady crew danced. Eventually, the club became so crowded that lines extended a whole block, all the way to the Hudson River. The tremendous degree to which audiences interacted across racial lines at the Roxy cannot be understated. According to DJ Africa Islam, the massive Roxy crowds broke down the prejudice barrier. Islam went on to assert, quote, it was a big open space, and that's what you need. Everybody got a chance to display what they did best at the Roxy. It was a lot of peace, a lot of harmony, a lot of rich, a lot of poor, end quote. Punk seamstress and sometime Roxy host Chi Chi Valenti recalled somewhat idealistically, quote, more than anything, the Roxy embodied a certain vision of what New York could be, a multiracial center spurred on by a current flaming a current of flaming, uncompromised youth, end quote. Sadly, when in 1984 the Roxy stopped holding Wheels of Steel nights, heavily integrated downtown clubs vanished as quickly as they appeared. Of course, the integrated scene of the early 1980s was hardly bereft of racial problems. Early interactions between hip-hoppers and punk rockers were not always without incident. Such initial exchanges were often marked by an atmosphere of mistrust and potential violence. The risk of muggings and violence was an important reason why few downtown kids went uptown to experience hip-hop firsthand. Likewise, it appears as though the threat of racism and being outnumbered stopped many hip-hoppers from attending most punk clubs. The Negril, the Ritz, the Danceteria, the Mud Club, and the Roxy all featured hip-hop shows and attracted a mixed audience. CBGB's, the club most commonly associated with the punk scene, did not, and there were few hip-hop artists who attended shows there in the 70s and early 80s. One event best underscores the racial tension that occasionally bubbled up at downtown hip-hop clubs. A year before the Roxy opened, punk fans threw bottles, full cans of beer, and fruit at Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, who had been selected by the Clash to open up for them at 2 of their 17 sold-out shows at Bond International Casino in Times Square. Assuming the hip-hop group to be a disco collective, punks booed the hip-hoppers off the stage and shouted racial epithets. Reporting on the 2 shows, one Village Voice columnist remarked that, quote, rather than achieve a cultural crossover, they threatened to widen the gap, end quote. Even the Roxy had its racial problems. Speaking to how white patrons often exoticized hip-hoppers, B-boy Crazy Legs recalled, quote, the Roxy could have also been a zoo. People were able to hang out in a cage with us and feel safe from getting beat up or stuck up, as opposed to coming to the Bronx, coming to a jam. It's like they were allowed to hang out with us in the cage and party with the animals. But on the flip side, it was also us getting into places that we never thought we could get into. So there was an exchange there. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, wow, it was so great back then, end quote. While performing at the Roxy did provide hip-hop artists opportunities to broaden their audience and make money, this could come at a cost. Many whites in attendance saw Crazy Legs and his peers as little more than curiosities. Cultural integration did not always imply racial harmony. Occasional racial tension aside, for Bronx artists to gain a larger audience and profit off their craft, hip-hop had to come downtown. Ironically, if hip-hop first came downtown as a largely non-commercial, not yet racialized culture, downtown cultural influence helped facilitate its development into a multi-billion-dollar industry and a decidedly black genre. Once the music headed downtown and became popular with white audiences, record executives took notice, and an ambitious African-American Queensbred promoter teamed up with a white NYU student from suburban Long Island to change hip-hop forever. Def Jam was founded by 2 men who religiously attended Wheels of Steel nights. Inspired by the mixed crowds, Russell Simmons and Rick Rubin eyed the big crossover. Rubin, a former punk guitarist, grasped the similarities between hip-hop and punk. He knew that if hip-hop was going to sell, it had to appeal to white rock fans. Thus, rap rock, an aggressive style of MC-driven hip-hop, was born. While hip-hoppers and punk rockers no longer met downtown, the 2 cultures would remain connected in Def Jam's music. In a sense, the record company brought blacks and whites together on wax, just as the downtown scene had in person. Of course, Def Jam was far more commercially successful. Yet the demise of the downtown scene should not detract from the era's accomplishments. Hip-hop and punk youths achieved much by embracing the spirit of punk rock rap. By unifying with their counterparts across racial and genre lines, hip-hoppers and punk rockers brought the South Bronx and Lower Manhattan together and for a fleeting moment integrated the downtown art scene. Thank you.
My question is, do you believe that because of the history and research you've done with this rap and hip hop punk, is that why they stayed grounded to who they were instead of changing to something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so there's actually some really interesting recordings of them. By the way, the Def Jam era is the next part of this, which I haven't researched yet, but kind of bringing, I'm very interested in continuity as opposed to breaks. And the way that these two eras of hip hop are studied, it's as if once the DJ is less important, there's a break and all of a sudden the golden age starts. So I'm more interested in seeing how they almost seamlessly flowed into each other and using punk as a lens to look at that. As to your question, there's some really great early recordings of them when they were still a hardcore punk band. You see that in some of their later music, too. I mean, their style, that kind of rap rock style, includes metal and it includes punk. But when you listen to songs like Sabotage, or, you think about the fact that they use their own instruments on stage every now and then at a time when probably only the Roots were doing that as well, you see the kind of the rock influence and the punk influence.
I'm just going to piggyback on what you're saying because before my time, they were banned from Columbus, Georgia, because they appeared on stage with a provocative gesture.
Yeah.
I can't really say because kids are here, but
that sounds like them.
Other questions?
Being that the hip hoppers went downtown because I guess the punks were afraid to go to their area, is it safe to say that maybe hip hop more so had a bigger influence on punk than punk did on hip hop?
The way that hip hop influenced punk, that's a really good question and something that I had to cut from this talk. The way that hip hop influenced punk was that you saw the style change a little bit cleaner clothes once, in this talk, I kind of conflate punk, new wave, and no wave, which a lot of people tend to do these days. When we think punk, we think leather, we think ripped clothes, we think safety pins, mohawks. When we think new wave, we think like cleaner clothes, sometimes suits and ties even. And I think certainly hip hop influenced that style. It also influenced the lingo that people used, the slang that people started using downtown. I think there's something fundamental, though, when a culture has to kind of uproot itself and go somewhere else, that it can't stay the same. And I'm not trying to put a positive or negative spin on that at all. It just simply can't. And so I do think that punk was less influenced by hip-hop precisely because it didn't have to go anywhere. They could maintain their clubs. They could maintain their audiences. Not every Bronx-based fan could come downtown. And actually, another thing I unfortunately had to cut from my talk is the Bronx scene then suffered because you had all the best bands going downtown, and all of a sudden Flash wasn't playing uptown anymore. They didn't pay him as much money. And I think that is actually one of the places where you start seeing the rise of other boroughs and their impact in hip-hop.
Does the project account for, at any moment, account for the booming style of many artists to have bands? And I think I saw Pharoah Monch in Chicago. I saw a few others, Slum Village, and a few others around the country, and everyone had this kind of live band. Even Talib Kweli travels with one now. And so this ideal of bands and this kind of, and particularly talking about someone like Pharoah Monch, that's in that kind of triad of Pharoah Monch, Jean Grey, Talib Kweli, and the whole I think it's Jvada media group.
Yeah.
How does your project account for that kind of trajectory now?
That's a little late for me. I think I'm probably going to stop at probably around 88, I think. But as to the issue of live bands, I mean, certainly as we discussed, the Beastie Boys have live bands. But the other really interesting thing that no one ever talks about with the fall of DJs, fall is maybe too strong, but the rise of MCs and kind of, is that on these initial recordings, for copyright issues, on the very first recordings, they couldn't have their DJs play. So they had live bands back them up. And all of a sudden, the person who is the leader of the group isn't even in the damn recording studio. So that's certainly something that interests me. I don't know how much it's going to come to this project. But there's also, along those lines, even though I'm looking at continuity, there's the very real notion that you don't have B-boys almost at all after this initial era, once Def Jam starts. You don't have many graffiti artists, in large part because the city cut down on them. The DJ is less prominent, so there are certain shifts.
I find all this really fascinating. Actually, both of these presentations were very thought-provoking. In the exchange between Dr. Moore and Professor Andre, and as well you talking about just the convergence of punk and hip hop. I'm really interested in whether the kind of backlash to those movements that came with the Reagan administration and the new silent majority, they kind of use as an excuse the drugs and violence. But I can very easily quote hundreds of lyrics from white groups, including The Clash, about guns and violence and, drugs and sex and rock and roll.
Right.
Yeah. And while there was a backlash, it wasn't attributed to race. But I'm just wondering if you could speak to maybe the real political problem that the conservatives were having was actually the fact that you had white people and black people together.
Yeah, it's funny because Ruza Kool-Aid Blue, who, the founder of the owner of the Negril and then the Roxy, I had another thing I had to cut from this, was a quote by her where she basically said, we were at the height of the Reagan administration and we were trying to do the exact opposite. We were trying to bring people together. Thus far, I haven't really found much evidence to suggest, although I would imagine it exists, that the so-called rise of neoconservatism, or of so-called neoconservatism, it's called by many different names, that they cared all that much about whites and black interaction. I'm sure they did, and part of that is cordoning off parts of the city, right? But then again, these punk kids they grew up in middle-class families, but they weren't exactly the kind of respectable people that the Reagan administration was hoping to protect, or that local neoconservative governments were hoping to protect. That said, these policies like planned shrinkage and benign neglect, something that I'm working on now, the much more political and social side of things, they cut firefighting services, they cut policing services, they cut hospitals and health service and drug rehabilitation services, with the hope that these communities will collapse on themselves and that the folks will have to go somewhere else. And they target and blame young people. The numbers for arson, this is amazing. Everyone thinks about in New York City in the 70s as one big arson fire. The numbers for arson are remarkably low. That's just what the government was actually reporting them as, and that allowed them to blame young non-whites for it. Whereas really what they were is, you're living in horrible apartments where the wires don't work anymore, and they're all pre-war, and they're all built out of wood, and the heat doesn't work, so people use other means, and things light on fire, and then it's a domino effect. So, you see them blaming the young people for their own condition, and then cutting services in the name of blaming them. Yeah.
I enjoyed your presentation. My question is, how do you define or separate punk rock from regular rock. And I'm pretty sure you're going to talk about Walk This Way.
No,
and
actually.
Aerosmith. Not today, but in your paper
Yeah,
or
at
in your
some
work
point.
at some point,
At some
because
point.
that was one of the major commercial crossovers.
Right.
And that leads me to saying, why do you think it was necessary that Russell Simmons felt like he needed white young people to like hip hop? So that's two different questions.
Well, I mean, I think you look at the history, I mean, even some of the musics you were discussing. I mean, take the disco as a great example. Disco wasn't selling at all until white audiences started taking part in it. I mean, white audiences were at the time a majority in the country. They had the most disposable income. And also, it was proven that they could enjoy this music downtown in a microcosm. And what's hip in New York oftentimes gets exported, halfway across the world. To what punk is, I always say that I don't know what punk is, but I know that a mohawk isn't punk. I mean, punk is the way that people normally describe it, and the reason that I feel comfortable describing bands like Blondie or the Tom Tom Club, who most people would associate as new wave with punk, is that these terms are so nebulous. And the New York punk scene was not as unified as the London one was. The London one was where everyone had this seemingly either nihilistic or heavily political attitude, all the black leather, some of which came from actually an American punk artist named Richard Hell. And they had the sneering attitudes, and they cut themselves, and that was not what New York punk was initially. The scene that we call New York punk included bands like the Ramones, who you might traditionally call punk, but also groups like the Talking Heads, Blondie, Television, which are harder to place. I think the do-it-yourself attitude is something. I think not having guitar solos and simplifying the music is something. The return back to small clubs as opposed to giant arena rock, and the idea that anyone can do it. But that could be just as easily said, like I said, about hip-hop or many other musics for that matter.
We probably have time for one more question.
Oh, I wanted to, going, I just wanted to state something. All right, could you make the connection between, I guess, Planet Rock, punk music, and German industrial music? Yeah, because when I think of Planet Rock, I just think of, what is that group?
Kraftwerk.
Kraftwerk,
Yeah.
yeah. Trans-Europe Express.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so this is one of the really funny things about, and something that I find just so lovely about this era and so kind of delightful, is that, if I can use delightful to describe early punk and hip hop, is that all of these punk artists want to play hip hop, but they have no idea what it sounds like. And all of these hip hop artists want to play punk, but they don't know what it sounds like either. So Africa Bambaataa knows that there's a scene downtown called punk, picks up a Kraftwerk LP and figures, this sounds punk to me. And so that's what it is. And punk rock rap, I interviewed Grandmaster Caz about it. And this was hilarious because I think I'm the first person to ever talk with him for more than 5 minutes about punk rock rap. And he was sat there the whole time bemused as to why in the hell anyone would care about this song that sold no records. And he told me that that they didn't know what punk was. They'd heard the term, they'd maybe heard one song, but that they were drawing on Planet Rock. That was what punk was to them. And so he told me that, he said, yeah, the general reaction to it when we released it, we were trying to get kind of a crossover appeal, but the hip hoppers looked at it and were like, what the fuck? And the punk artists looked at it and they were like, what the fuck? Sorry if there are kids in the room.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.